marker of the base.
Mr. Ron Carter.
James Brown, Aretha Franklin, Miles Davis, Jefferson Airplane.
Yeah.
He's in the Guinness Book for being on the most recordings.
There's only one Ron Carter.
Friday at 9 on WTTW.
The most beautiful music in the world.
It's an oasis.
An education in itself, listening to it.
I always feel that I'm learning something new.
Magnificent.
It's the best classical music station in the country.
Discover your next family adventure in the 2022 WTTW Great Treasure Hunt Sweepstakes. 40 winners will win fun for the whole family with admission for 4 to Chicagoland's very own Santa's Village Amusement Park. You'll enjoy thrill rides, petting zoos, water parks, and more. There are over 200 chances to win. Don't delay. Enter by October 23rd at WTTW.com/sweepstakes or call 773-509-1111 extension 2 for your chance to win.
WTTW programming originates from the Renee Crown Public Media Center. Programming that enriches lives on WTTW is made possible in part by the estate of WTTW's longtime trustee, Marv Goldsmith.
Next time, an eccentric author hires Frank and Lou.
Someone stole my final chapter from my final book.
But as they investigate the case, they'll have to navigate an artistic temperament.
The paranoid recluse waving a sword around.
Shakespeare and Hathaway.
Saturday at 9 on WTTW.
Hi, I'm Catherine from Bronzeville, and you're watching WTTW.
Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. On the show tonight,
Let's amend it, but not end it.
changes are coming for the Safety Act as the controversial law takes center stage at the final governor's debate.
Just the opportunity to have affordable housing here, I think, is going to help every single business.
Chicago is looking to transform old office spaces into residential units in the face of high occupancy rates in the financial district. We have a live report.
New guidance on screening kids for anxiety from a task force of children's mental health professionals.
With temps dropping, that means road salt is soon hitting the streets, the impact on local waterways, and how you can help.
Advice for parents on how to protect kids from sexual abuse and how to empower children to protect themselves.
What I love is seeing the photograph materialize and grabbing it before it really changes.
We head to the West Loop for photos of some of Chicago's most communal moments featured in a new exhibit.
And Brandis and Paris, as you mentioned, I'm on LaSalle Street in the Financial District as part of our Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood series. With office occupancy still a big challenge in this part of town, city leaders are hoping to revitalize the area as a place to live in addition to working. We'll talk about that and other ways to reimagine parts of the Loop coming up. But first, back to you.
All right, thanks, Nick. We'll check in with you shortly, but first, some of today's top stories. The Cook County Sheriff's Office announces a new initiative to discourage would-be carjackers. Car owners can sign an online waiver to allow law enforcement to track cars quicker in the event of a carjacking or if a car is stolen.
In the event your car was taken, immediately the tracking can start going on. And as you can see, when we track cars, we recover them quickly. And we have the ability to stop future crimes.
And once people give that permission online, the Sheriff's Office will mail out stickers to be placed in vehicle windows to act as a deterrence.
Police confirm a 5th abduction and robbery victim in Wrigleyville. All 5 armed robberies have occurred near Clark and Addison Streets by Wrigley Field. Chicago police say a gunman forced the victims into a car and drove around as they were robbed of wallets and cell phones, then kicked out of the car. Alderman Tom Tunney is asking police leadership for more officers assigned to the area, especially as Halloween approaches. Meanwhile, businesses and the Lakeview Chamber of Commerce are increasing private security efforts.
No fare hikes under the CTA's proposed budget. The proposed $1.8 billion budget was unveiled today. It also avoids service cuts or price increases and spends on hiring and increased security. The CTA also released a $3.4 billion five-year capital improvement plan, which looks to invest in major projects such as the Red Line extension and modernizing CTA's bus fleet and railroad cars. The transit agency's ridership is still below pre-pandemic levels.
Coming up in the program, an alternative bill to the controversial Safety Act.
But first, reimagining Chicago's financial district. That and more from our In Your Neighborhood series right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
LaSalle Street in the Loop has for decades been home to Chicago's financial district. But as those firms and other businesses have started locating their offices in other parts of town, and with the massive shift in work patterns driven by COVID-19, this 8-block stretch has become home to more vacancies than any other part of downtown. Now the city's got an ambitious plan to spur development, making the financial district a place to live, not just to work. As part of Chicago's Tonight's In Your Neighborhood series, reporter Nick Blumberg and producers Acacia Hernandez and Blair Paddock spent the day in the financial district, and Nick joins us now. Nick.
Brandis, 1,000 new places to live. That's the goal laid out in Chicago's LaSalle Street Reimagined plan. The idea is to convert some of the massive amount of unused commercial space on LaSalle Street into 1,000 residential units. The city's eyeing incentives, including tax credits and an existing TIF district. The idea isn't just about places to live, but places to eat, shop, buy groceries. The hope is that it'll breathe new life onto a street that's seen big changes.
As banks started moving into newer buildings, we saw LaSalle Street start to empty out. And we have millions of square feet of underutilized space here that could be easily converted into residential. And there is a strong appetite and demand to live downtown closer to where you work. We're going to be changing the zoning code to facilitate that, and then working with the property owners, the surrounding community, and certainly the administration to revitalize this street with new shopping, restaurants, entertainment, and then living above these beautiful historic structures.
Those older buildings are the ones that have faced the most struggles with vacancies, according to the Building Owners and Managers Association. But empty space is a struggle around downtown, with about 42% of tenants in the office on a busy day, BOMA says. Its executive director told us mixed use is the way to go.
What you're seeing in a lot of office buildings that are still generally doing well, is in neighborhoods that are doing well, if you look at the Fulton market, is they have this different mix, right? Live, work, play, learn, etc. And so the core idea, I think, of converting in some of these areas where you're having older office buildings, very low occupancy, is that you're supplementing that with a little bit more residential. It's on the street a little bit later in the evening that supports more retail and some of those other uses and just the general feel of the street. And the value proposition to us of that, the return on that investment, is that you're going to get more office development.
Now, the physical attributes of those historic buildings can make conversion a challenge. That's why backers of LaSalle Street Reimagined say developer incentives have to be a priority. Another priority, making sure the residential units are open to people with a range of incomes. The city's plan calls for 30% of units to be affordable. Affordable housing advocates say having a mix of rates can be an effective way to create housing options in a place like the financial district.
Sometimes it's finding an opportunity that is in a development or a building that, might have, a substantial amount of sort of market rate housing. But there is room within that development for a certain number of affordable units. Even in neighborhoods that are built up, right? There are, people who work, people who are, have low and sort of moderate incomes who may work in that area and want the opportunity to live near where they work.
Living near work could be a boon to many of the employees at the kinds of area businesses that have faced a post-COVID staffing crunch.
a lot of the people that work in these restaurants, work in the hourly jobs, food and beverage, the service industry, they're coming from an hour away. So just the opportunity to have affordable housing here, I think is going to help every single business, not just in the LaSalle corridor, but around the city.
Scott Weiner's 90th Meridian, like many restaurants in the area, has had to cut back their hours of operation based on demand. He hopes having more people living along LaSalle could make business more stable.
You really feast your famine based on foot traffic in the area as well as your business clientele. So if the offices are at 30% occupancy, you can expect to be at 30% of what you thought your sales might be. So it's definitely been a new normal for us as we've come out of the pandemic.
LaSalle Street is not the only part of downtown that's been facing challenges. Coming up, we'll hear how State Street and Michigan Avenue have been faring, and we'll talk more about the need for affordable housing, both in the Loop and around Chicago. But for now, back to you.
Sounds like no small plans. Nick, thanks. We'll see you in a little bit. Now to Paris and a controversial law taking center stage in this year's elections. Paris.
Brandis, changes are coming to the controversial SAFE-T Act. That's the new law that does away with cash bail starting in the new year. It's become a political flashpoint in the race for governor, and it took center stage at the last debate.
His SAFE-T Act is going to let prisoners out of jail. It's a revolving door on all of our jail cells across Illinois. We ought to amend the SAFE-T Act to make sure they can't do it. Let's amend it, but not end it. And Darren Bailey is defending a system currently that allows people to buy their way out of prison.
So what are the changes that are coming, and will they solve the concerns of state's attorneys who worry about the law's impact on crime? Here with more are Jamie Mosser, Kane County State's Attorney, and Sharon Mitchell, Cook County Public Defender. Welcome both of you back to Chicago tonight. State's Attorney Mosser, 2+ months away from the implementation of this law. What are your concerns at this point?
So the biggest concern that we have is to make sure that there are enough offenses that are out there that are potentially dangerous or based on what the person has done, that they can be held. Right now, there's a detention net that limits us in who we can ask to be detained. Through our discussions, we're expanding that to make sure that state's attorneys and judges have the ability to hold people who are a danger to our community. That's one of our biggest concerns that we've seen and what we are discussing with the sponsors and advocates of this law at this point.
And I want to get to some of the proposals put out there by sponsors and advocates. Sharon Mitchell, the complaint you've heard, especially from Republicans, is that there will be a litany of crimes, as the state's attorney mentioned, that prosecutors will not be able to seek detention for. How do you address those concerns?
Well, first off, it's far from unusual for a major piece of legislation, especially one as expansive as the SAFE-T Act or the Pretrial Fairness Act, to have trailer bills. In fact, there have been true trailer bills about the SAFE-T Act already. And quite frankly, the advocates have anticipated that there will be changes. That's the reason why we supported a bill passed or bill that was signed, that was written about a year back, HB 5337. We anticipate there are going to be changes. The thing that we're focused on is we need to ensure that when we end cash bond, we don't exacerbate racial disparities and we don't explode jail populations. So I'm excited that we're participating in negotiations with the state's attorney's office led by the Illinois Senate and Illinois House. And I'm glad we have leadership both in the governor's office and at the legislature that understand how important it is for us to end cash bond in a responsible way.
And I think the two of you are kind of in agreement in principle on the broader component of this. And let's talk about the proposal in the Senate that's gotten the most traction. This is from State Senator Scott Bennett from downstate Champaign. His proposal would seek to clarify the language on detainable offenses, give judges more discretion to deem someone a flight risk and thus detain them in jail. And then it would make sure that the language is clear that those detained before this law is implemented would not automatically be released upon the new year. State's Attorney Mosser, do these changes assuage your concerns about the bill?
Very much so. Senator Bennett's bill looks and follows the New Jersey law that has eliminated cash bail. It gives us the ability to argue that certain cases based on their fact pattern and not just based on the charge are something that should be detained because of dangerousness or a flight risk. But in addition to that, it does add in language as to what we are supposed to do for the cases that are happening now through January 1st, because we don't know, is it a prospective law, January 1st on, or is it retroactive? Because we have been in these discussions, we know that throughout the 102 counties, everybody's going to be doing something differently. That's not justice. We should have a clear direction on how these cases handled so that the way that they're treated in Cook County with Mr. Mitchell is the same way that they're treated here in Kane County.
Sharon Mitchell, the changes in the Bennett proposal, are these the right changes?
Well, we believe in its current form, the Bennett proposal would explode jail populations and it would really exacerbate racial disparities. With that said, we anticipate that there will be changes to the law, and we're glad that we're in conversation with Senator Bennett. We're glad we're in conversation with the state's attorney here about how we can make this law correct. I will say this, though. Currently, the status quo is far from perfect. It's actually a disaster. And even in its current form, we believe the Pretrial Fairness Act is a huge improvement. Will there be tweaks and changes? There are tweaks and changes to every bill, in every law. But we are just excited to be involved in the conversation, and we just want to make sure that when we make this change, we don't go to a place where we're exploding the jail population, which has real impact on communities, especially Black and brown ones.
Well, Sharon Mitchell, what about this bill do you think would explode the jail population?
Well, I think there's kind of a misconception that judges under the current law don't, they just don't have the ability to detain people. And the reality of the situation is that there is an expanded ability when you in cash bond to detain people. When you give judges the ability to detain anybody, everybody, well, you can go into a situation where jail populations will just explode. So what the key portion of the Pretrial Fairness Act does is says, let's in cash bond and let's create clear standards for when we can detain people. When you remove those standards or make those standards too lax, you can kind of go around the other way where the jail populations of all 92 jails will just explode and racial disparities will explode. So we just want kind of some... Go ahead.
What about that, State's Attorney Mosser? What about that concern that it could swing the pendulum too much in the other direction?
Dan, this is where we disagree. I think in Senator Bennett's bill, it puts out those clear restrictions. The state's attorney's office has to prove by a clear and convincing evidence that a person has committed, well, first of all, probable cause that they've committed a crime, but then clear and convincing evidence that we should detain them because they are a danger or because they are a willful flight. That is a burden that's put on us, and a judge has to find that. What is consistent between Senator Bennett's bill and the pretrial fairness is that there are checks and balances in all of that, including the ability for the person to appeal. So I think this is not going to explode the population because right now, state's attorneys everywhere have the ability to ask for people to be detained because they are a danger or a flight risk. The law that Senator Bennett has proposed gives us the same authority and even sets our standard higher than what we have now. There are much more checks of what we have to do, how we have to prove it, the procedures before it. So I think the people who are going to remain in jail or will be in jail are the dangerous people. But as Sharon said, we want to eliminate cash bail because I don't want a dangerous person to be able to walk out of jail because they can pay their way out of there. That is not a fair system. I think Senator Bennett's bill does what we want it to.
And that is a system that exists currently and has existed. Sharon Mitchell, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office has been struggling with attrition and staffing levels. A lot of ASAs that have left the office. Is it ready to handle the load here for these extra detention hearings and all the things that it's going to need to do come January 1st?
Well, let's be clear. When people are arrested, they have to go before a judge in the status quo. And we have to make decisions about what's going to happen to that person. So the fact of the matter is we're just asking for folks to make better decisions about what happens to a person. And that's a key point that you just said. When we need to worry about kind of the capacity, and when you open up detention decisions to every single person, then you really run into those capacity issues. If we have to make a decision on jaywalkers or people charged with retail theft or whether they should be in jail for a year, or 2 years, or 3 years, that's when you run into those issues. So what we want is a balance. We want there to be clear standards about who can be detained and who can't be detained. And although I'm very appreciative of Senator Bennett, and I think that there's some points there, what we are concerned with is that it opens up gates to everybody. And what we believe is that if the bill is passed in its current form, then we will explode jail populations. We're here to talk. We're here to listen. We're here to make changes. But in its current form, it will create a massive problem with racial disparities and increase in tension.
And as I understand from lawmakers that we talked to, there are negotiations that are happening every day on this. State's Attorney Mosser, what about some of the other provisions of the SAFE-T Act that are going to go into place?
One of the other ones that we were very concerned with is a judge's ability to issue a warrant for the arrest of a person if they fail to appear in court. The way that the Pretrial Fairness instituted is that we would have to issue a rule to show cause and a summons, and that would have to be served on a person through civil process. Now, the problem is that has the potential to shut down cases. I am happy to say that in our discussions, I believe that there has been a movement towards allowing judges to still issue warrants, but with the preference for somebody to issue a rule. Because we know, Mr. Mitchell and I have seen this before in our careers, there are sometimes people who do not come to court because of financial reasons. We don't want to put them in jail and make it worse. However, we want to be able to have a system that will hold somebody accountable, especially those individuals who purposely evade court and evade the prosecution.
So again, it seems like, yeah, go ahead, Sharon, really quickly.
Yeah, and quite frankly, we agree. We believe that the language as it exists now actually gave judges the option, and that there were interpretations that thought that warrants would be abolished. That's not the case, and I'm glad that we've been able to come to a clarification on that. So that's really not a concern.
It seems like a lot of agreement and a lot of discussions that are still ongoing, and we appreciate you discussing this with us here at Chicago Tonight. Thank you so much to State's Attorney Jamie Mosser and Sharon Mitchell, Cook County Public Defender.
Thank you.
And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Paris, thank you. In another move signaling the nation's ongoing mental health crisis, a national panel of healthcare professionals is recommending all kids get screened for anxiety starting as young as 8 years old. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force makes this recommendation on the heels of the same one for all adults under 65 just weeks ago. The CDC says anxiety is one of the most commonly diagnosed mental disorders in children. It estimates nearly 5.8 million children ages 3 to 17 in the U.S. were diagnosed with anxiety from 2016 to 2019. That's almost 10% of U.S. children. Joining us are Dawn Lavorsi, a therapist with the Family Institute at Northwestern University, and Tali Raviv, Associate Director at the Center for Childhood Resilience at Lurie Children's Hospital. And thanks to both of you for joining us. Tali Raviv, let's start with you, please. This recommendation, as I just said, it comes on the heels of the same task force making the same recommendation for all adults under 65 just weeks ago. How significant is this new recommendation?
Well, I think it's a really positive move on the part of those mental health and health professionals, because we know that early intervention and early treatment is the best chance that a child has to continue to succeed in life and in school and all the things that they need to do. So I really applaud this move. And I do think it is in the wake, as you say, of the ongoing mental health crisis. We know that a study looking at summarizing 29 studies from across the globe showed that there's about a 50% increase in the global rates of childhood anxiety and depression, with about 20% of young people estimated to experience anxiety. And so it is a really important thing for us to address as a society.
What does this say about mental health in our country?
Well, I think we know that there was a crisis prior to the pandemic. The 2016, about 4 million children had unmet mental health needs. We know nationally about 50% of youth with a diagnosed mental health disorder get treatment, and that was before the pandemic. And so when rates are rising so steeply, as we've seen in the wake of the pandemic, we know that our current mental health system is not meeting the needs of young people. And so we need to do a better job addressing things early, raising mental health literacy, and improving access to mental health care where children live, learn, and play.
Dawn Lavorsi, we just heard Tali Raviv say that, it was a problem before the pandemic, but then there was the pandemic. How did that impact anxiety in children?
Sure, I think in a number of ways. I think we saw children experience a lot of social isolation during that time. So some of the normal places they might go to for support or for help were not available to them. Their schedules and their lives got turned upside down, as many of us adults can relate to that. But children thrive on structure, and the structure was removed. And in it, we saw a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unpredictability, a lot of just not knowing, a lot of loss, and a lot of fear of loss. So I think that's kind of where the pandemic has left a lot of children.
How might anxiety present in children?
It's going to look different in different kids. It's going to look different depending on developmental stages and some of just personal characteristics of the kid. But in younger kids, you might see more physical ailments, more stomach aches, or more just generalized kind of physical, I don't feel so good. Older kids, you might see avoidance, you might see irritability. It might look like they're being lazy and, you know, just spending all the time on their phones or the internet, but that may be, you know, kind of driven by anxiety or worry.
Tali, what are some of the common factors that contribute to increased anxiety in children?
Well, first we need to really think about family history. We know there's a strong genetic component to anxiety and depression as well. And so families really want to think about what their family risk factors are. In addition to that, we know that any childhood adversity or exposure to trauma, so things like poverty, exposure to violence, lack of a disruption in caregiving, those kinds of things can have a really strong impact on young people. And then we want to also think very carefully about the role of the supports that they have for them. So we know that young people who are not supported, so that might be youth who experience discrimination, youth who are immigrant or have refugee status, youth who are minoritized and might be experiencing you know, things like that, LGBTQ plus populations. We want to look in particular at those young people and be really proactive about getting them support.
Dawn, as a provider, what might be some of the challenges in screening children? Because if a kid has, you know, the annual checkup, there's not a whole lot of time for doctors. Do practices need to build in a different infrastructure to manage this?
Well, you know, I defer to the practices on how they manage that, but I think this is a positive step in that we screen for a number of things, you know, with kids: vision, hearing, scoliosis, I remember. So I think this is something that we can do. Providers can figure out a way to make this an annual process or a regular process, like we do with other health, you know, screenings. I think also, you know, having a primary care physician or having somebody who knows the child well, kind of doing this on a longitudinal basis can really help, you know, parents, families decide, you know, what steps to take.
What advice do you have for parents with keeping an eye out on, you know, how soon that screening might need to happen?
Sure. Talk to your kids. Recognize that not all communication is verbal. So, you know, your kid is communicating whether or not they're speaking verbally to you. So look at their behavior. Any sudden changes or any, you know, they used to love an activity, now they're not involved in it. They used to talk to these friends, now they don't. Those would be things to kind of check in on.
Tali, what are the consequences of not addressing anxiety and providing that early intervention?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest misconceptions for families is that the kids are just going to grow out of it on their own. That's true for, you know, the typical run-of-the-mill anxiety that kids have, you know, worry about the monster under the bed. But for some young people, anxiety that is untreated is not something they're going to outgrow. So if it's starting to affect their you know, ability to do their typical activities, go to school, go to friends' houses, interact socially, or it's just causing them a lot of distress. They're having a lot of headaches or stomach aches. They're just feeling upset all the time. It really can grow. It can also lead to secondary depression. So when kids are anxious and they're not able to do the things that they feel that they should be able to do, they can start to become isolated and depressed. And so it is really good to catch this early, because the good news is that we have really effective treatments. Cognitive behavioral therapy has been shown to be effective for kids. Even really young kids can really benefit from that. And of course, there's also medication for cases that are more severe.
Tali, we've got about 20 seconds left. Some of the challenges with accessing mental health care.
Yeah, that is something that we at the Center for Childhood Resilience are particularly cued into. And we know that most kids who need treatment are never going to make it to my lovely office down in Streeterville downtown at Lurie Children's. And so we need to do a much better job raising mental health literacy among all adults that work with young people. That means teachers, coaches, whomever. And we do a lot of work, especially in the school system. Kids are there all day long. So the more we can build up supports in the school system and in the communities where children are living, the better off we're going to be.
Okay, that's where we'll have to leave it. My thanks to Dawn Lavorsi and Talia Raviv for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Up next, examining Chicago's most communal moments in a new exhibit. Stay with us. Do you think there's been sort of a rethinking of how those events happened here in Chicago?
I made a promise to myself in my career that every year I would make a piece of art dedicated to the memory.
Got into a zone of mentor to children. See what we could do to kind of elevate each other. We all we got at this point.
I'm using my past to push forward, to build a movement to create the world that we all want to see.
And there's much more ahead on the program, including more from Chicago's financial district. But first, an exhibit at the National Hellenic Museum in Greektown is showcasing some throwback moments of celebrations in the city dating back to the 1980s. Arts correspondent Angel Ito introduces us to Diane Alexander White and shares how she captured Chicago.
What do the Greek Independence Day Parade, the Bud Billiken Parade, and the Mexican Civic Society Parade all have in common, aside from being parades, of course? Well, they were all photographed by Greek photographer Diane Alexander White.
It's almost like a surrealistic thing going on. You've got like girls dressed as caryatids acting as they are columns, as they would, you know, if they were sculpted at the Parthenon, and then against Marina Towers. So, I mean, that's like thousands of years of difference, right? So those kinds of things are what I love to kind of look for.
It's the summer of 1981, and White is a college photography student on a mission to capture Chicago. No matter the parade or festival, her goal was to capture the importance of community, a value she was raised with.
Growing up Greek was part of a community, a really loving, inclusive, fun. You know, we had our own festivals and church picnics, as they were called. The Greek parades were a big part of that as well, because at that time in the 80s and the 70s and before that, those parades took place in city streets downtown. So Michigan Avenue, State Street, Dearborn. So you have these incredible buildings as a backdrop.
Primarily featuring photos from 1981, the exhibit also includes community gatherings from 1974. Those moments range from the Chinese New Year Parade, the Jewish Festival, and many more.
What I love the most, and you'll see it in many of these photos, is groups of people. So like an en masse, where it's like they are there for a particular reason. I had an instructor who said, don't just focus on the event itself, but who's around the event, who's observing it. That was in 1981 when Jane Byrne was mayor, and that was a very important thing to her. Chicago Fest was a big deal, and then having all these different neighborhood events. So I photographed 18 that summer.
While White has since moved from the city streets to the Chicago Field Museum, documenting artifacts, she says her love for capturing moments in time will always be rooted in celebrating similarities rather than differences.
You know, we love to gather, and that's what this is about. It's gather together. You're gathering whether you're like bringing your friends into your home or you're going out together as a group, whether it's to eat Greek food or any other kind of food, but really kind of share your ethnicity and who you are and where you came from and where your family came from.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
You can see Gather Together at the National Hellenic Museum in Greektown through the end of the year. And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Paris, thank you. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, winter is around the corner, and that means road salt is soon hitting the streets. The negative impact on local waterways and wildlife, and how you can help. How downtown's business district is faring and what upcoming revitalization efforts look like. We're one-on-one with the Chicago Loop Alliance. Plus, advice for parents on how to protect kids from sexual abuse and how to empower children to protect themselves. But first, some more of today's top stories. Pandemic-affected homeowners can receive up to $30,000 in mortgage assistance starting next month with no strings attached. The funds can cover past due mortgage payments and up to 3 months of future payments or delinquent property taxes, homeowners insurance, as well as condo or homeowner association fees. To qualify, Illinois homeowners must have experienced financial hardship from the pandemic after January 2020, currently own and occupy the home as their primary residence, be at least 30 days late on their monthly housing payment, have a household income at or below 150% of the area's median income, and be able to demonstrate they communicated with their mortgage provider about their inability to pay or sought counseling with a federally approved counseling organization. Applications are being accepted from November 1st through the end of next January. Illinois lawmakers stood with Afghan refugees today to advocate for expanding visa eligibility for some refugees. Senator Dick Durbin and Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky are calling for Congress to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act, legislation that would expand eligibility for special immigrant visas.
I think the United States knows what the right thing to do is. And don't tell me about vetting. We're doing all the vetting that is humanly possible. This is a false and phony issue that somehow these are would-be terrorists.
More than 70,000 Afghan nationals were admitted into the U.S. after the collapse of Kabul. Those refugees' temporary status ends in 2023. Advocate Aurora is reporting a data breach affecting as many as 3 million patients. The health system says, out of an abundance of caution, it's assuming that anyone with Advocate Aurora Health MyChart account, including users of its scheduling widgets and Live Well app, could be affected. Advocate Aurora says the investigation found that no social security numbers, financial accounts, credit cards, or debit card information was involved. The health system has disabled or removed the code and launched an internal investigation. And now, Paris, we toss it back to you.
Thanks, Brandis. How much road salt ends up in Illinois waterways? That's what a new study hopes to answer, but with help from winter chloride watchers. WTTW News reporter Patty Whitley joins us now to explain what exactly that is. We'll get to that in a second. Patty, we saw the first snowflakes of the season just a couple days ago.
Some of us saw them, a lot of us
I did not, so it didn't happen unless I saw it. But that means snow's coming with that road salt.
Yes.
Remind us why road salt can be problematic.
Well, because we spread so much of it, a lot more than we need, and so a lot of that, when it dissolves, it winds up in the meltwater that works its way through our sewer and stormwater system, and it ends up in our streams and waterways. And if you think about how we as humans can't drink salt water, neither can freshwater wildlife, whether it's invertebrates, fish, plants. They evolve for fresh water, and when we dump a whole bunch of salt in, that causes all kinds of problems. It can outright kill some wildlife, or it can create sort of cascading issues for them.
And the issue is chloride here in the water, and I think we have some statistics on how much chloride levels are found in fresh water and ocean water. Do we know how much is found in Illinois waterways, in the Chicago River, the canals?
Right. That's what this study is all about. I'm going to look at my notes and cheat, but it's the National Great Rivers Research and Education Center in Alton, Illinois.
So that's who's doing this study.
They run this Illinois River Watch program, and they're recruiting volunteers who will, from, sometime between like November to, let's say, March, April, the winter season, will volunteer to go and monitor and test areas in the state's waterways, and to establish like baseline levels before the snow and road salt season starts, and to see how these chloride levels are affected. And they do have data that we looked at from 2021 where it shows low levels in October. You see when the first snow happened last year, and those levels do spike, and some of them were actually over the level that the EPA says is okay for aquatic life. So what they're going to want to see is, are programs like, CDOT might have, where they're using beet juice mixed in with the road salt. Is that lessening the chloride load? Or are too many of us still putting way too much salt on our sidewalks, in our driveways, in our parking lots?
Does beet juice mix do the job like salt does in clearing roads?
There's a lot of things like sand can do the job, or just less salt. If you ever see, someone told me once, if you can see the salt, that's too much salt. When you see those clumps, you've applied it wrong and you've applied way too much, and it's aquatic life that's going to pay the price
But
for
you
that.
know what happens to Chicago mayors when the streets are not plowed. They pay the price politically.
I know, and everyone in conservation is aware of that, and that's why we keep trying. They keep trying to get this message out. Salt, proportionately. You're not going to oversalt your food. Stop oversalting our roadways.
All right, Patty Whitley, very interesting study. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paris.
And you can read Patty's full story on our website, where you can learn how to sign up to be a winter chloride watcher. It's all at WTTW.com/news. And now, Brandis, we toss it back to you.
Paris, thank you. And now to Nick Blumberg, who spent the day in Chicago's financial district as part of our In Your Neighborhood series. Nick.
Brandis, I'm here with Michael Edwards, President and CEO of the Chicago Loop Alliance. Thanks for coming out tonight. We appreciate it. So we've been talking about the LaSalle Street Reimagined plan. What would you encourage city leaders to bear in mind as they're trying to bring more residential into the Loop?
Well, the Loop is a really exciting place. We have a lot of residential people down here. We're in the middle of doing a residential study to find out exactly what they want. And a lot of what they want is what we see here on LaSalle Street. There's a lot of opportunity here, a lot of challenges, but there's a lot of opportunity. We're excited about working with the city.
What do you see as some of those big opportunities?
Well, there's a lot of retail space here, and a lot of it needs to be converted into some other kinds of uses. And there's a density here that's really special, and the architecture is world class. And so we just think it's a place where people will want to be if they can reimagine it other than a banking center.
Yeah, thinking about, other parts of the Loop, places like State Street, some of the commercial centers that, there have been issues around vacancy even before COVID. How are the efforts going in terms of trying to breathe new life into those stretches?
Well, we've been tracking, that's a great question. We've been tracking data since the pandemic on how things are happening downtown compared to the impact of the pandemic. And everything's trending in the right direction. Some are slower than we'd like. So office right now throughout the Loop is at 50%. We'd really like it to be much higher than that. We expect it will be by the end of 23. Retail is difficult, although we have some great stores and some new stores that have opened up on State Street, which is our retail center. And as I indicated earlier, there's 45,000 people living downtown. And up until just a few months ago, demand for apartments was the best it's been before the pandemic.
And thinking about different ways, obviously you can bring in new retail businesses to those stretches. I know there's also been some work to do, things like pop-ups, have some, creative reuse. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, pop-ups the city's been using those since the pandemic, which is terrific. We don't have a lot of those because our space tends to be a little bit more expensive for pop-ups. So what we've done is try to activate the street. So many of your viewers may have participated in Sundays on State that we've had the last 2 years, which was really, really effective, and really encouraged a lot of people from around the city who haven't been in the Loop in a long time or never to come down and actually have a business and make a little bit of money and just be part of the Chicago vibe.
Yeah, how can those sorts of events, that kind of programming, whether it's, Sundays on State in the warm weather or things during the holiday season, bring people into this area?
Well, the holidays are a huge part of what goes on in the Loop. And so we're really excited about all the things that are happening, will happen again finally after 2 years of COVID. So the Chris Kindle Market and the tree lighting and all those great things. The windows at Macy's, of course, are tradition. But we're taking all of the vendors, and many of them, 70 of them, from State Street and moving them into what we're going to do, a holiday market. And so the holiday market will be in one of the larger retail spaces on State Street. We're excited about it. It'll be one more thing to do when you come down and do your Christmas thing down here in the Loop.
Some of us still want to call it Windows at Marshall Fields, but I'll let that one go.
I hear that a lot.
I know obviously tourism is also a big part of the downtown economy. How have you seen those numbers rebound?
Yeah, that's another great question. So office has always led our economics of the Loop. And of course, all of that has changed. And tourism and visitors and people coming down to the theaters and staying in hotels. So hotels were at 90% last month. We're headed into winter, so those will begin to come down, but we're almost at 100% occupancy for hotels compared to 2019, which is great because they long suffered.
All right. Well, Michael Edwards, President and CEO of the Chicago Loop Alliance, thanks for talking with us. We appreciate it.
I appreciate it.
We'll have more coming up about the need for affordable housing in the Loop and around the city, but for now, back to you.
Nick, we'll see you soon. And up next, protecting kids from sexual predators. That's in a conversation that first aired on Chicago Tonight Latino Voices with Univision's Alex Hernandez. But first, a look at the weather.
For any parent, child sex abuse is a tough topic to even think about. But as uncomfortable as it might be, talking about sexual abuse with kids is one way parents can help protect them from it. According to the CDC, about 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 13 boys in the U.S. are sexually abused. 91% of abusers are known by the child or child's family. Female victims of child sexual abuse are at higher risk of sexual violence victimization in adulthood. And all victims of child sexual abuse are at twice the risk for non-sexual intimate partner violence. Joining us now with advice on how to start those conversations with kids and more is Tanya Haig, co-founder and president of Parents Against Child Sex Abuse. Tanya, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Alex.
Tanya, I want to start talking about your organization. How did you come to start your organization, Parents Against Child Sex Abuse?
So thank you so much for having me, by the way. So 5 years ago, we go by the acronym PAXA because it's a lot of words in there, but very important ones. This situation impacted my family. And what we found was parents had not been in the conversation when it came to this topic. There's a lot of data that supports leading up to our organization how long this topic has been in medical journals, in white papers, as I like to call them, white paper land. But now we're at a place where, because of the Me Too movement, it's really reached at a level where the culture is much more informed about these circumstances. We've got adults talking about their childhood experiences. So when this all came about for us 5, 6, 7 years ago, we wanted to close that gap and help parents so they're not blindsided. They're more informed now than they've ever been before, and that's what we're trying to do.
Well, talk about the Kids Too movement. What is this?
Yes, so the Kids Too movement is on fire right now, Alex. We actually started using the hashtag Kids Too about a year ago when we were participating in a coalition that brought a lot of other nonprofit organizations around the subject of online safety. What happened was the pandemic the data shows that over 20 million cases had been reported to the cyber tip line. That's where everyone calls in about online exploitation of children. COVID and the pandemic just blew the doors open of making social media platforms and technology expose the fact that kids were being victimized through social media and other tech platforms. So we started this rallying cry around this Kids Too movement that builds off of the Me Too movement. People get the connection, and we've really been on that road this past year, getting parents more aware and informed.
How soon do you think parents should talk with their kids, have conversations about potential sex abuse?
So, like you said at the beginning, this is a tough conversation or even thought to have. It's one that we always want to shove, but we know that it's out there, it's happening under our noses. So our point of view as an organization is that as soon as a kid is verbal, for some can vary, but let's say 2 years old, it starts talking to them about their bodies, and that conversation, obviously, it's very different from a 2-year-old to a 10-year-old to a 15-year-old. It never ends. It's about health, and that's really where we're coming from. It's marrying this concept of health and safety, and a lot of the times that topic is uncomfortable for parents, so they leave it to the school, and that's not enough.
So how can they adjust that conversation while their kids are growing? Like you're saying, it's a different conversation. How do parents adjust to that?
How they progress? Well, as a lot of parents know, when we start engaging with our kids and talking at their level at 2 years old, 5 years old, we always talk about meeting their kids where they are. So the conversation might start about their bodies and understanding what's okay and what's not okay. And then it starts, having check-ins with them about the adults that are around the kid. Are you comfortable around this uncle? How is this coach? And you just meet them at that level. And parents, for us, that kind of comes naturally over progression of time. What we want to invite parents to do is to keep having check-ins with them, not just about themselves, if they're seeing the behavior is a little bit different or their emotional state has changed or even physical sometimes, but also start asking them about the people that are around them, the kids, the teens, the cousins, the family members, the coaches, the teachers.
The adults, like you said, 'cause now that you know school is back in session, you know, that is very important. And kids might feel, I don't know, uncomfortable or shy to tell their parents if something might be off. How can we make them feel comfortable to talk about that and report that maybe they feel uncomfortable with an adult?
Yes, so the more that we can encourage kids to use their voices and to trust that their information is going to be believed, that's such a barrier. Most of the time, kids don't get believed. This topic is highly underreported. Only 38% of kids actually disclose, and that's not even close to being representative of actually what's happening. So what we want to do is, you know, as it comes from the parents, Alex, and that's what I'm really here to do, is empower other parents to let their kids know and then use their village to keep communicating.
This takes me to the red flags. What are the red flags that the parents should be looking out for?
Right, so there's so many documentaries out there right now. So hopefully in the culture, people are starting to know that this is very common. You have got national cases like the U.S. volleyball team. Basically, some of the predatory red flags are, it impacts parents and kids. If an adult's trying to isolate your child, meaning spend just alone time, it can seem so harmless sometimes. Oh, let me do this favor. That adult wants to be so helpful. Really, we want parents to be, instead of like, oh, thank God, someone's taking this kid off my hands, we want parents to be more protective, a little bit more of a guard up, and just be more in tune. So isolating the kid and treating that kid special, making that kid, exploiting their vulnerabilities is something to look out for.
Very quick, and just to end this, we've got less than 30 seconds. What steps can parents take?
Okay, first things first, we want parents to talk to their child. If they've never had this conversation, it's never too late. Ask them, has anyone ever made you feel uncomfortable? Has anyone tried to touch you inappropriately? And if anything ever happens, come to mom and dad. We'll believe you.
Definitely, very important.
Yep.
Our thanks to Tanya Haig for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Back with more Chicago Tonight right after this.
And now we check back in with Nick Blumberg, who has spent the day in the city's financial district as part of our In Your Neighborhood series. Nick.
Thanks, Paris. We're here now with Yvette McCaskill, organizer with the Bring Chicago Home campaign. Thanks for coming on tonight. We appreciate it.
Of course.
I want to talk about that campaign in detail in just a moment, but first we've been talking about this LaSalle Street Reimagined plan. A part of that calls for having 30% set aside for affordable housing. What's your reaction to that portion of this idea?
I think that when you say, okay, we're doing this revitalization campaign and 30% of it's going to be affordable housing, that sounds really good. But when the mayor says affordable housing, we know that that's not really addressing the issues of like homelessness across the city, right? It's not affordable for the people that really need it. And if that's, you know, your housing plan, then there definitely needs to be something else in place. It's a good line, but when we talk about affordable housing and housing people, that should start with the most vulnerable.
Well, to that end, how do you seek to address the needs of the folks you see as the most vulnerable as part of this Bring Chicago Home effort?
Yeah, so we're campaigning for Bring Chicago Home, which is a legislation that would raise the real estate transfer tax on high-end properties that are sold in the Loop. Things like the Thompson Center, recently sold to Google. And that would create a dedicated revenue stream that goes toward addressing homelessness in the city, wraparound services, subsidized housing, and things to get people off the street, and also address the larger issue of these 65,000 people in this city that are experiencing homelessness in a multitude of ways.
Yeah, I was going to say, for folks who don't know the idea of what you all call doubled up, what does that mean, and how does that, as you see it, increase the total of folks who are homeless, that you would call them, but perhaps not living on the streets?
Yeah, we see that a lot, especially as an educator. I saw that a lot when we were doing like remote learning. You see a lot of families, people that are living in a unit that's meant for one family, multiple families in a unit. It's a problem that's like huge across the city. It's a problem for lots of young people in the city that may not be experiencing homelessness in the way that you think about, people out on the street, but they still are very much experiencing the detriments, the trauma of that experience and need help.
As you've been trying to garner support from alder people to get that referendum on the ballot to raise the real estate transfer tax, obviously there are a lot of hoops to jump through there. There are going to be some hoops to jump through in Springfield as well. What kind of support have you been able to garner? What have those conversations with lawmakers been like?
In general, when we talk to lawmakers about Bring Chicago Home, there's support, right? There's really no downside to housing people, right? That's a positive thing. So when you talk to people about it and give them the plan for like how we can actually go about providing those services, people are on board. Now, Bring Chicago Home has been around for 3 years, and the mayor hasn't responded to our demands in any way whatsoever. It's kind of ironic. It's kind of the way that people are treated, like conditioned to respond to homelessness, to ignore it, to make it seem like not address it as a problem. Is kind of how she's treating our campaign right now. We would like that to change. In February, we would hope to have that referendum on the ballot and actually be paid attention to and have people that really have these needs be taken care of.
Well, thank you for telling us a bit about your efforts, Yvette McCaskill, an organizer with the Bring Chicago Home campaign.
Thank you.
And we have heard a lot about the needs of folks here in the Loop as well as around the city. That's us. That's it for us, rather, from the Financial District. Back to you.
Just a second, Nick, before we let you go, we heard about that LaSalle Street reimagine plan that the mayor came out with. What's the timeline for that project?
Well, it's certainly not going to happen overnight, Alderman Riley told us, and he's right. The request for proposals, those applications are due in late December. The city is then going to go through what they receive, and officials have said they want to release a list of finalists early next year. But obviously, there's still going to be a lot of work to be done. We heard about the fact that particularly in these older buildings where there is a higher commercial occupancy rate, that means there's lots of opportunities to convert it to residential, but it also means that in an older building, there's more work to be done. It might not be set up to as easily convert it into a home as a newer building might be. So it's not going to happen quickly necessarily, but it is certainly something that city officials are eager to get off the ground.
I wonder if we see the day where the trading pits become a condo or something like that. Nick, thanks very much. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Thursday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
And you can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7 for the Week in Review in person. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud of its partners named Illinois leading lawyers by the Law Bulletin Publishing Company of Chicago.